Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Today's episode is a little bit different because I'm going to be sharing a snippet from my channel, Film Schooled, where I typically interview writers, directors, actors, and more about the filmmaking process. But this specific interview that I just released on Film Schooled has a lot of crossover to Preacher Boys because I interviewed Jessica Landry. She is a screenwriter who recently wrote a slasher film called Killer Body Count. Now, you're probably listening and wondering, what does a slasher movie have to do with Preacher Boys? Well, let me tell you a little bit about the plot. The plot centers around a teenage girl who is mistakenly labeled a sex addict by her super religious family and is sent to a religious reform camp by herself with a bunch of random kids she's never met before. Does that sound familiar to some of the stories that I talk about on the show? After arriving at the camp, obviously the kids start getting picked off one by one by a masked killer. And as a horror fan, as someone who talks a lot about religious trauma, this thing just checked all the boxes for me. And I think a lot of people in my audience would probably be interested as well. Just fair warning, it's pretty gory. I wanted to share a small portion of my conversation with Jessica Landry where we talk about the religious influences on the film. So whether you're a horror fan who's interested in watching the movie or someone who's not interested but wants to talk about some of those themes, this episode is for you. And of course, if you want to check out the full conversation with Jessica, head over to the Film Schooled podcast or YouTube channel by following the links in the show notes of this video or podcast episode. Thank you so much for watching. Let's get my conversation with Jessica Landry. I have to imagine, and I always think about like if I were to make a narrative film, like I think slasher would be such a fun thing to do, but it's also like intimidating because there's so many and so many that are not good and so many that are great. Like there's and then there's people that watch slashers are like the most critics ever, you know, they have certain things they want. Were you polling, like, did you sit down and watch a bunch of slashers to see like what to avoid and what not to, or like, did you just have the encyclopedia in your mind of like, I want to kind of take this moment and twist it? Like, what are some of the slasher greats that were like pumping through your veins as you wrote?
I definitely have an encyclopedia in my brain of all these movies. I have definitely watched all of them more than once. But I did sit down and I watched all the Scream movies again, just because that was something that Tubi really wanted to get like the tone of. And I think Killer Body Count ended up being a little bit more on the funny side as opposed to Scream.
Sure.
But Scream actually had like a lot of funny moments in
Right.
it, which I didn't realize. Because I mean, the first time I had seen those movies, I mean, for you it was the Saw movies growing up, right? For me it was the Scream movies.
Yeah.
So you know, I've always kind of loved them, even 4 and 5.
Yeah.
Despite their flaws. But no, it was really fun to just kind of go back and like be like, no, I have to watch these for work. This is work right now. I need to sit down and watch all of these movies. But yeah, and just kind of go through and try and like think of, it's kind of a horrible thing to say, but think of different ways to kill people, right? Like, what could I possibly use that nobody has really done before? Right. And I tried to also keep it religiously themed, kind of fitting in with the whole theme of the movie. I tried to pull as many death sequences as I could from the Bible to see. And there was one that didn't make the final cut, which really broke my heart. But Dan, the Jesus boy, he was supposed to have nice, like, Jesus-y hair, but he did not, which is okay. He was supposed to get decapitated by crawling through like a thorny bush and getting his hair tangled in the bushes, which is directly from the Bible and happened to somebody. And then they ended up getting decapitated. That got cut for many reasons, which is okay. But it would have been great to see, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I tried to do as many biblically themed deaths as I could. So like the locker room scene getting crushed under the weights, that is an homage to people being crushed by rocks in the Bible. That happened.
Yeah.
When Toby gets it in the confessional booth, he gets a spear in the side. That's another reference. Yeah. The thurible to the face is not something that happened in the Bible, but I mean, who knows? Who's to say that it hasn't happened before? We don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just tried to keep it as themed as I could because I thought that was it's kind of a funny way to explore those depths.
So I got to ask this, and I can't believe I didn't ask it sooner. This movie, like I said, for me, it hits on a lot of layers, like as someone who loves horror, and then also as someone who has seen firsthand many religious horrors through his life. Is that your background, like, or was that something that you just are, as an outside observer, were like, this is a weird subculture, let's talk about it?
I grew up Roman Catholic.
Okay.
I'm now an atheist. For me, growing up, I mean, my parents were obviously religious. That's where it kind of all stems from, right? It's like your family is into it. So when you're little, you have no choice but to be into it. You follow your parents, you don't question them. But for me, as I grew up, and, became more aware of things, just going to church, like, didn't sit well with me. It was never something that I really liked doing. I always thought it was a little weird, and, like, no shade or anything to anybody who's Catholic. Like, it's all good. Like, do your own thing. But for me, it's not my thing.
Yeah.
And so I always kind of looked at it critically. I do that for all organized religion.
Sure.
I'm not a huge fan of it, but like I say, like, if that's your thing, if you believe in a higher power, amazing. That's great. For me, I don't love it when people try to push that upon other people, right? Or try to take like a Bible verse and spin it to their own sort of hateful beliefs. I'm not into that at all.
Or putting them in a summer camp and killing them one by one. Like any religious activities like that are no-go.
They're no-go, and I'm sure that's happening. So we have to put a stop to that. But yeah, it's just that sort of thing just doesn't sit well with me. And I mean, I kind of in a weird spot where I can write a slasher movie about it, and people have watched it, and people like you are responding to it, which I think is wonderful to see, because there is a lot of trauma that comes from religion.
Yeah.
And it affects us all kind of differently. We all have different experiences with it and everything like that. Some, of course, very more severe, some not as severe, but trauma is trauma. And, if something is causing you trauma, then I say remove it from your life as fast as you can, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's that. I'm glad you answered that, because I was curious. Like, it again, it felt so timely, because like my other podcast that I do, I talk about religious abuse and trauma. So like that's kind of the two worlds, is like movies and that. And a lot of people I interview on that show were sent away to religious reform schools or conversion therapy or troubled teen homes. And so like I've seen movies that come out where like people are just like, oh, they've observed it and they think it's interesting. And then there's other things where I'm like, there's some things that feel a little too like known, from the author side to be like, oh, I studied this for a week. And then we're like, I'm going to jot this down. So I was curious about the background.
For me too, being as a woman too, right? And growing up through the church and like seeing how, women and sexuality are two things that everybody tries to keep very separate and shuns women for being sexually active, whereas kind of turns a blind eye to the boys when they do it too. That was a huge thing for me. Like, equality for everybody. Like, everybody is a sexual being. That's okay. That's wonderful. Like, nobody should be ever interfering with who you love or why you love them, or if you just want to get laid. Like, it's really not that big of a deal, but some religions tend to think it is.
Was anybody in the script influenced by people you knew in real life or situations that you experienced in real life? Or you're like, I'm not going to say that. I wrote them mysteriously for a reason.
Let me think how I could say that.
You're like, yes, next question.
The authority figures for sure. I think when you're younger, especially when you're a teenager, especially when you're a girl, a lot of men feel like they have a say in your body and what you do with your body. And that is something that, I have a daughter. She's very young now, and I'm trying to be very cognizant of how I talk to her about, she's only 8, so she still has a while to go before she gets into this phase of things.
Yeah.
But still, it's like being aware from the start of how to make sure that she is confident within herself, and how she knows that it's her body, her choice. She can make her own decisions, and just, telling her to be smart about things, right? When the time comes. And that's not necessarily something that I had growing up. I had probably the opposite of that. And it fucks with you for sure, right? Like it messes you up, and it takes a lot of therapy for some people, writing slasher movies for other people, to kind of figure out how to navigate that, right? And how to openly have a conversation about it.
Yeah. It's something. I have a 6-year-old and a 6-year-old daughter, and
Yeah.
it is funny looking back, not to sidetrack into just religious conversation for the next, 30 minutes, but it's somewhat unavoidable given the premise, but it's one of those things. Like, now I look back at like my friends who were girls raised in the church, and I'm just like, as a dad, I can't imagine putting my kids in this like toxic circle of like teaching. But even beyond that, like, just like beyond just like the guilt and shame and things, like the feeling of powerlessness of not being able to do anything, like the fact that like the denomination I grew up in, like the dream of being having a job was like not a reality for like a lot of the kids. You know what I mean? Like, it's
Really?
like, I'm going to get married, I'm going to have kids, I'm going to do the Duggar thing, like it's going to be, you know, that's going to be my life. Like, my job is to be a wife and a mom first and foremost, and some got to do jobs if they had the cool parents, but it's like, that's a really sad thing, and I just feel super conscious about it. I resonate with that. Like, I feel very conscious now about like, oh my God, like, you know, what role models are there? What media is there? What is there to show something different other than this? And, now I feel like the dude, I'm like, oh my God, that's so cool. There's like Rey Skywalker toys, like, cool, let's do
Yeah,
that,
right.
but it's an interesting perspective. And it's one too, kind of segueing out of that, like, that's one of the things I really appreciate about the horror genre right now, is like there are a lot of female voices that are coming in, and just, it's not that they're, it's not, and there are some of these, but it's not specifically movies that are like, we're going to subvert the male gaze and like we're going to do the opposite. But it's literally just the little changes in perspective that you notice, that you're like, oh, I've never seen that before, because it's been dudes directing these types of movies for so long. Um,
Yeah.
what were some of those key moments? I know obviously like the girls spying on the guys showering is such an obvious twist of like what you would see in an 80s or 90s slasher. Like, were you sitting there thinking about certain scenes and going like, how do I turn those on their head? Or like, what are some perspectives you think were missed in a lot of horror movies, up to this point? And I know like there's been a lot of female directed horror movies, but in mainstream horror, what are some things you think have been kind of missed from the visual conversation or like the script conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think just even having female voices coming to the table is a huge step forward. But even thinking back further, like the original Slumber Party Massacre, right? That was written and directed by women,
No,
but it had a producer who had a lot of power. I think was it Roger Corman?
I don't
Or was it Roy?
remember. I
I
don't.
think it was.
Well,
Uh,
if only I could Google it. Let me look really quick.
if only we had computers nearby.
And just so you know, anytime I'm looking down, I'm probably writing a note or looking at something. So
Okay, that's okay.
I always feel weird, like, oh, let me text while you give your answer. Slumber Party Master. I don't think it was Corman. Let me
I'm
look.
gonna look too. Also,
It was Roger Corman.
okay,
Oh
got my
no.
facts right.
I love Roger.
So
Roger Corman is like the most inspirational and then sometimes frustrating person.
yes, yes,
I
understood.
he
But yeah, he produced that, and I mean, he obviously had a lot of say in how it ended up turning out, because there's a lot of just like literally like chess scenes, or there's
Yeah,
at least one that I can think of in the locker room. And as my cat glares at me from the side here,
little Pet
he's
Cemetery action.
a little bit, my dear old boy. But yeah, I mean, in terms of that, like, especially for me, having been born in the 80s, growing up in the 90s, watching all those movies, it was always very clear that none of these movies were meant for me, right?
Sure.
It was always, it's always for men. And you just, at some point you grow kind of desensitized to the amount of boobs that you're seeing on the
Yeah.
screen, but you're like an elephant, you never forget. And so when like for me, when I'm in a position now where I can actively write these movies and they get made, I am of course very aware
Yeah.
of where horror has come from and what I would like horror to look like in the future. And it's not to say like we're not trying to be prudish or anything, like there can't be sex. Obviously, if you've seen Killer Body Count, there's a lot of sex in that movie. But I mean, there's just like we don't need to be, leering at a woman's ass for like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Like this is not, we don't need to see that. Everybody's got an ass. Like I don't really want to look at a man's ass for 5 seconds. Like it's just tell me the story, not show me the body parts unless they're dismembered from the body itself.
Right. Or it's integral to the story, like a Hellraiser, where it's like that's Hellraiser without
Hellraiser.
nudity and sex would be a very different movie. I don't even know what that movie would look like. But yeah, I definitely get that. I think Roger Corman, I was trying to find it while you were answering, but I remember hearing an interview with a director that worked for him, and he had like a kind of like Lifetime. He had his rules for movies, but like it was like every so many minutes you have to have like a boob shot for the movie to work. He had like the formula. And he had a bunch of other things too. Like if there's a motorcycle, you have to blow it up. Like there was a bunch of random rules and things.
That's fair.
But yeah, the motorcycle one, cool. Yeah, it's definitely, again, like it's one of those things where like Slumber Party Massacre, like you see those little bits of things that are very different, and then you see like, oh, we didn't have the chance to go all the way with this, or we had to do these other things to get it through. I'm curious, what's your take on have you seen Revenge? Okay, I figured before even asking, but what was your take on how that movie handled, because the big difference for me going into it was like, rape revenge genre is my least favorite generally, because
same,
but it's always because the movies are usually about an hour of rape or torture and then about 15 minutes of get them back, whereas revenge is the opposite. And I think it's very tactful, but like it also very much plays up the male gaze in the beginning of the movie, like, and all the tropes and things that you'd expect. Like, what was your take on how they kind of handled that blend?
Yeah, I think too, like all these revenge rape stories from before were all, pretty much written and directed by men. Revenge is written and directed by a woman. So I feel like she came into it very aware, of course, of what she was doing. And so everything felt very intentional, right? And so while it's uncomfortable to watch, of course, sexual assault and all that, you know that it's coming from a woman. And I think knowing that, there's almost like a bit of a safety net to it too. You're like, okay, I know that she's not going to like, throw a Roger Corman sort of sequence in there. There's no locker room scene. And then to have spoiler at the end where like the guy is just like literally running naked through the house, right? Just kind of like the tropes on the side, how it's usually just the woman who's naked all the time running about. I mean, I just thought it was a really well done film as far as that genre goes. But yeah, it's one of those movies where you watch once and you like it and then you'll never watch it again because it is hard to watch. Same with The Nightingale.
I haven't seen
Jennifer Kent did. That one is very intense. That is like a murder, rape, revenge story, and it's very good, but it is very hard to watch.
Jennifer Kent, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. Add to watch list. There we go.
There you go. It's probably on Tubi somewhere.
It's on Canopy, which is an also underrated streaming service.
Yeah.